Well, in this first segment of this larger lecture on imperialism and the thinking or the rationale behind America's entry into this larger imperial policy, imperial campaign. I'm not sure quite what the best word there would be. I want to let you know that the larger argument I hope to make, I'll try to make, really seeks to join together what the United States is doing abroad. That means, outside of the boundaries of the United States, with what's happening inside the boundaries. And I happen to think that that's a very telling connection to make and very, very worthwhile to consider. But I want to start out, and I'll do so in this first segment. I want to talk a bit about imperialism. It's a word you should know. It's a word with which you should be familiar. And I'm not claiming to have developed some grand definition or explanation of imperialism. But I've tried over the years to sort of borrow and steal from people and come up with a definition that I felt offered at least some basic understanding of what I mean by imperialism. And simply put, I would suggest to you that we may define imperialism as a policy of extending a nation's authority by territorial acquisition or by the establishment of economic and political hegemony, there's your word, or dominance over other nations or peoples. Now, I don't know, that may not be the best definition, but let me see if I can sort of explain it. First of all, the notion that it's a policy, that it's more than just an idea, but it's an idea that offers direction for action. Secondly, that imperialism involves some level of expansion or extension. Now, you could argue that the United States has been expanding throughout its history, from the Atlantic coastal colonies of the British Empire further on. The United States has continued to expand across the lower 48 and into Alaska and ultimately into Hawaii. And that's true enough. But we might consider that this process goes beyond the creation, say, of colonies. That it's not necessary, as you saw prior to the American Revolution, for the creation of colonies for imperialism to function. But it is sufficient. It is sufficient to avoid merely acquiring territory if, by other means, one can impose one's will. If a country, and often when we talk about imperialism here, we're talking about countries. Sometimes we're talking about individuals operating on behalf of countries or under the guise of policy from nations. Nation's a big word, very important word. Nonetheless, my point here is it's not necessary to take and hold territory to participate in imperialism. It's often the case that happens. It's often the case there are colonial desires, but it's not inherently necessary. This word hegemony, for lack of other or alternative words, really means dominance, but you can have hegemony that is cultural. And hegemony tends to flow in one way, one direction, from powerful to the less than powerful, and by means of culture, control of words even, this dominant power can push its will, can impose, perhaps is a better word, its will over other nations or peoples. It's not necessary to control directly the resources of a place. Instead, it's enough to use your power to push or see that others are getting those resources for you. So you can practice an imperialism that's predominantly economic or political, but not necessarily territorial. Although, again, territory is often taken and held. Again, I don't know if that's a quality definition or the best definition, but it's sort of the one I've come up with over the years. And it seems to serve the purpose. Now, there's a process that seems to operate in terms of imperialism. Certainly in the late 19th century, we see it. And let me go through that with you so that hopefully it will make sense. The first step in this process tends to involve the investment of capital. This can be done by a nation state, but most often it's done by a private interest, someone who sees the opportunity in a nation other than, say, the United States or Europe, outside the West, to develop resources. And resources are key. Resources are going to feed the manufacturing centers of the established nations, those who have the power to become imperial powers. The first step is investment of capital in resources and the development of those resources through things like mining, agricultural work, and also we may see the development of an infrastructure. That simply means the word infrastructure simply means things like railroads, telegraph lines, utilities, the mechanical systems that are necessary to carry out everyday life, that are necessary to carry out business, commerce, to communicate, to move goods, all that. That's what I mean by infrastructure, things like bridges. Well, anyway, investment of capital, usually to develop resources that are largely undeveloped through industries like mining, through agriculture, and to develop an infrastructure in an underdeveloped or undeveloped area. So you have one nation who sees money to be made, who sees resources, and the business people within that nation seek to invest in the development of those resources and to invest in the infrastructure that's necessitated to get at those resources. That's step one. Step number two, the presence of the investment of the industries, of this effort to get at these resources will inevitably alter the local culture and the local economy. New ideas are brought in. Elements that perhaps have been largely absent from the lives of people in the area being developed, suddenly, these alien ideas are suddenly part of their everyday existence, whether they be technological or whether they be social, how one is to live. Step three, the investors, companies, corporations, will seek to make favorable arrangements with one or another local group to guarantee the security of those investments and properties that they've made, that they've purchased. This is where you begin to open up the possibility for factionalism. If there's already political factionalism in the area being developed, then you have the prospect that company will choose sides. And we've seen this happen before in geopolitical terms in North America during the colonial era, prior even to the French and Indian War, as these competing nations of Europe began to move into the Americas, into North America particularly. They made alliances with various Native American people. They wanted fur, pelts, and they were willing to exchange the means of war, of making war, for those pelts. Imperialism works much the same way. You invest money, you want to see returns on that money. You've begun to reshape culture, and remember we talked about immigrants. We talked about the economic changes in the United States in the previous lecture. And we talked about the potential fear that can be caused by these massive transformations taking place, as if life as you've known it just isn't going to be the same way anymore. It's never coming back. Well, imagine in an underdeveloped region when massive machines, massive numbers of individuals who speak different languages than you and seem to understand a world that's different from yours, they relate to one another in ways that perhaps you've never seen before fully. Imagine the potential for the generation of fear. There's the fear, indeed, that my group, my people, my family may be left out of whatever's going on here, may be left out of whatever gains are to be made. So it behooves the investing company to find those elements in society that are willing to work to protect the interests of the company. But when the time comes, step 4, and the investments in development are threatened to the extent it looks as if they may be lost, there seems to be a tendency among investors to call upon the federal government or a government. I mean, it's enough simply to think about, for instance, the British, to think about the wars that were fought in India and fought in Africa. That's the model. And by the late 19th century, the United States is in a position to fight those wars, to protect the investments that its people are making abroad, to begin to engage beyond North America in the concerns of Latin America, but also the Pacific, of Asia, of Africa, and to begin to put its stamp culturally and economically on the earth. Consider for a moment that the 20th century will be known as America's century. The roots, the very foundations of that American dominance, U.S. dominance, are to be found here. Here in the latter 19th century, in the economic changes that have occurred since the Civil War, but also in the first fledgling steps by which the United States, this new industrial power, will step off this continent to explore and ultimately control territories beyond its shores. This industrial giant. By then, by step 5, what may be imposed we may call hegemonic dominance, control. Sometimes subtle, sometimes violent. Think about it before I go in this segment here, and think about it for just a moment. What is it that's part of the strikes we talked about from the last lecture if it's not violence? What is it that's part of those strikes if it's not intervention, often military? That's why, and there are other reasons too, but ultimately I want you to understand that the argument, whether you agree with it or you don't, it's fine with me. The argument that I will be making in this lecture is that what happens abroad, what happens in the Pacific, what happens in Africa and Asia and elsewhere involving the United States and its expansion, on the level of principle, on the level of basic relationships of power, those who have it and those who don't, shares parallels with what's happening domestically here at home. Remember, in places like Appalachia, here in the mountains, it's about resources. Who'll own them? Who won't? It's about the protection of investments. When people react who are very much afraid that they'll be left out. But it's also about that thing called cultural hegemony, about the control of meaning and symbols. That's part of the story here, even in these United States.